Sign that check now." The buyer from Memphis said the words loud enough for everyone in the lobby of the Lauderdale County ASCS office to hear. On the counter, the check read $5,600, the price being offered for her family's 22-acre cotton allotment for 4 generations of labor worked into the same fields. The buyer raised a hand with a small smile and explained that most small-town farmers could no longer keep up with modern cotton economics. Then he added, "A woman in your situation doesn't have the luxury of putting off a decision like this." The room went quiet. The older farmer looked at the check one more time, then looked the buyer straight in the eyes and said only 4 words, "This isn't for sale." 3 weeks later, 27 similar offers made to families across Lauderdale County, Tennessee, would be formally withdrawn. Because Verlie Mae Honeycutt had known something for 34 years that the buyer would never know. Her father-in-law, Wendell Honeycutt, had negotiated for 3 weeks with a federal office in 1938 and gotten a special clause written into the family farm's cotton allotment. And that clause made the number on the check completely meaningless. Verlie Mae Honeycutt was 56 years old. She lived on an 88-acre family farm in Lauderdale County, Tennessee, on the south bank of the Forked Deer River, 3 miles outside the town of Halls. The farm had been in the Honeycutt family for 3 generations. Her father-in-law, Wendell, had bought the land in 1908, and her husband, Estill, had inherited it in 1956, when Wendell died. When Estill died of a heart attack in September of 1965 at the age of 57, Verlie Mae was 49 years old, and she had been running the farm alone ever since. 22 of those acres were dedicated to her federal cotton allotment, and on the remaining 66, she grew soybeans and sorghum. Everyone in Halls and Ripley knew her for 2 things: a woman who paid every debt in full and stayed out of every piece of gossip, and a farmer who, when she came into town, drove an open-cab 1965 John Deere 4020 with no canopy on it. In the 7 years since her husband's death, she had never been a single day late on a payment to the Halls Farmers Bank. The 1972 cotton harvest had ended in November. That year, Lauderdale County had averaged 410 pounds of lint per acre, and Verlie Mae's fields had brought in 460. Cotton prices nationwide were running around 28 cents a pound. Her 22 acres had brought in roughly $3,000 gross, and after costs were taken out, $1,800 remained. That was just enough money to run the farm for 1 more year. On the morning of Tuesday, November 14th, while she was waiting at the counter of the Hall's Cotton Gin, a man 40 paces away caught her attention. A man in his late 30s, in a dark blue suit and polished shoes, standing next to a Lincoln Continental with Memphis plates. Verlie Mae watched him talk to the gin manager, Lonnie Beckwith. Then Beckwith turned to him and pointed her out with his hand. The man came over and introduced himself as Wallace Drummond. He was the senior buyer for the Memphis Cotton and Mercantile Company, had been there since 1968, and he carried a thick, leather-bound notebook and a checkbook in his hand. He explained that his company was running a program to consolidate cotton allotments in Lauderdale County, and that the cleanest way for older farmers to step away, before they got worn out, was better for everyone involved. Verlie Mae listened to him in silence. Drummond pulled a piece of paper from his pocket. On it was a number already calculated: $5,600 for 22 acres. After taxes, you'll have somewhere around $4,800 in your hand. That's 2 years of net income without you having to farm a day for it, he said. Then he added, loud enough for Beckwith to hear, "Let's be honest with each other. If you turn down this offer, no other company in Memphis will come near you. Your town is a small town." Verlie Mae did not touch the check on the paper. She just said this: "I'll be at the ASCS office tomorrow afternoon. If you're serious, we can talk there." Drummond smiled, closed his notebook, and walked back to his Lincoln. Mae arrived at the ASCS office at 2 o'clock the next afternoon. Drummond had come in half an hour earlier and was already sitting with the office manager, Earl Tyndall. Tyndall was 58 years old, had run the Lauderdale County ASCS for 19 years, and was the kind of man who liked making most of the town's decisions comfortably from inside the lines of federal bureaucracy. When Mae walked in, Tyndall did not stand up. He just pointed to a chair. Drummond placed his check on the counter and chose his words. "Sign that check now." There were 2 other farmers in the office, and the secretary, Mary Lou Hageman, Drummond wanted them to hear. Then he turned to Tyndall. "Earl, can we begin the transfer on this allotment today?" Tyndall adjusted his glasses and said, "Mrs. Honeycutt, this is a very fair offer. The modern farming world isn't carrying small farms anymore. Widowed women running an operation alone don't have the luxury of putting off strategic decisions like this one." The room went quiet. Verlie Mae looked at the check, then at Drummond, then at Tyndall. Then she put her hand into the pocket of her coat and said only 4 words. "This isn't for sale." Drummond kept smiling, but his eyes hardened. "Maybe you'll think it over for another week. Our offer is open until December 1st, he answered. Mae stood up from her chair and walked to the door. Behind her, she heard Tyndall say, "Mrs. Honeycutt, you can come back and we can talk again. I can walk you through the federal rules in detail." But she did not stop. On her way out, she felt a shadow watching her through the glass of the door, and then she sat down behind the wheel of her Ford F-100 truck and drove home. That evening, while Verlie Mae was sitting at the kitchen table, the figure $5,600 turned over in her mind. This did not mean selling the farm. It only meant selling the allotment. But losing an allotment meant losing the right to grow cotton on that land forever. Without cotton, the 22 acres would have to be planted in soybeans, and soybeans alone could not carry the farm. Verlie Mae knew this, but deeper than that, she knew something else. Something her father-in-law Wendell had said to her a long time ago in the summer of 1953 while he was standing next to the cedar cabinet in the office. Wendell had been 73 that summer, and it was his last fall. 3 years later, he would die. "I'm saving this paper for your tomorrows, child," he had said, "because one day someone is going to come along and tell you it has no value." Verlie Mae did not know in 1953 exactly what day Wendell was talking about, but on that cold November evening in 1972, she now knew that the day he had meant was this day. She got up from the kitchen table, walked into the office, stood in front of the cedar cabinet, and reached for the handle of the bottom drawer. The bottom drawer opened smoothly. Inside were 3 old document envelopes. Verlie Mae pulled out the first one, a 1948 mortgage declaration. She pulled out the second, a 1955 tractor purchase invoice from Estill. When she saw the third, her hands stopped. On the envelope, in Wendell's handwriting, were the words, "Federal Farm Agreement, 1938. Mae opened the envelope carefully, spread the 4-page yellow document out on the kitchen table, and read. When she got to the 7th article, she stopped, and she began to read it out loud. "The cotton allotment subject to this agreement is bound to the production farm defined herein, and may not be transferred to a third party without the written consent of the production farm's owner or legal heir." Then she read the final sentence. "Every transfer shall require the written approval of the Tennessee Agricultural Stabilization and Conservation Service State Committee, not the Office of Federal Record." She folded the document, placed it in a small file folder, and set it next to the telephone. In the summer of 1938, Wendell Honeycutt was 58 years old. That year, with the expanded implementation of the Soil Conservation and Domestic Allotment Act, the federal government was bringing a new offer to small cotton farmers across the country. In exchange for accepting a federal limit on yearly production, they would be granted a guaranteed allotment for generations to come. The federal officer who came was Lawrence Bardwell, 35 years old, the program manager for the USDA office in Carrollton. He came to visit Wendell at the beginning of September. Wendell read the standard agreement at his kitchen table, and one point in it bothered him. The allotment could be transferred to a third party by the Federal Office of Record without requiring the farmer's written consent. Wendell told Bardwell this was illogical. He explained that if the farm passed from one generation to the next, the allotment ought to stay tied to that family as well. Bardwell refused at first, saying that federal agreements came in a standard form. But Wendell corresponded with Carrollton by mail for 3 weeks, and in the end, Bardwell realized that the language Wendell was proposing had been pulled directly from another federal law, from one of the articles of the 1936 Agricultural Adjustment Act. What Bardwell could not object to was the reuse of language his own agency had already accepted in another law. The 7th article was added on September 23, 1938, and the agreement was filed the same day. The next morning at 8, Verlie Mae called Nashville. Theodore Wickham was a retired agricultural law attorney who had helped to still in a neighbor's property line dispute back in 1962. He was 71 years old and still worked 3 days a week. Verlie Mae summarized Drummond's offer, Tyndall's words, and the 7th article of the 1938 agreement. After 15 minutes of questions, Wickham said this: "Mrs. Honeycutt, if that agreement was entered into the federal record in 1938 and was never formally cancelled afterward, the 7th article is still enforceable. The 1971 amendments changed the tobacco allotment system. Cotton wasn't touched. The farm of origin doctrine has been protected for cotton since 1938. Verlie Mae then asked, "Then what does this check mean?" Wickham was silent for a moment, then added, "Legally, nothing. Come to my office tomorrow and we'll prepare a petition for the ASCS State Committee." Verlie Mae went to Nashville on Monday, worked with Wickham for 3 hours, and the formal petition for the federal record was prepared. But for the petition to be valid, it had to be confirmed that the original file copy of the 1938 agreement existed in the ASCS records. Verlie Mae had Wendell's personal copy in her possession. The federal office's copy should have been in the ASCS file room in Halls. That was a file room under Earl Tyndall's control. When Verlie Mae returned to Halls on Tuesday morning, Mary Lou Hagerman stopped her at the street entrance on the ground floor of the ASCS building. "Mrs. Honeycutt, I may not have forgotten what was said in the office last week," she said quietly. "If you're looking for the federal copy of the 1938 file, the Honeycutt folder is in the file room, 3rd row of the HK shelf, under the 1938 tab. Mr. Tyndall is going to Ripley at 3 this afternoon for a county agriculture meeting. The office will be empty except for me at 4. Verlie Mae looked at her, said nothing. Mary Lou added, "These federal records being open to the public is already official policy. It's just a policy nobody has ever had the nerve to ask about." The ASCS State Committee hearing was held on the morning of Tuesday, December 5th, 1972, at the State Agriculture Building in Nashville. The committee had 3 members, a retired county farm manager, a USDA legal counsel, and an agricultural economist. The attorney for the Memphis Cotton and Mercantile Company, Charles Brycerson, had his main argument cleanly prepared. The Agricultural Act of 1970, passed in 1971, had simplified the mechanisms of allotment transfer, and therefore the 1938 7th article was not enforceable under modern conditions. Brycerson spoke for 30 minutes, then sat down. The committee chair turned to Theodore Wickham. Wickham, 71 years old, stood up, adjusted his glasses, and said these 7 sentences. honorable committee, the 1971 Act simplified transfer, but it nowhere invalidated pre-1938 protective articles. The Federal Register clearly states the Section 344 saving clause. Previously existing contractual rights are legally protected. Mrs. Honeycutt's agreement was filed in 1938, is still active in the federal record, and its farm of origin clause is preserved in writing. The Memphis Cotton and Mercantile Company has no legal claim to this allotment without Mrs. Honeycutt's written consent. My client refuses to give that consent. Wickham sat down. The committee chair read Wickham's document, then Drummond's document, then the 1938 federal agreement, one after the other. Then he raised his head and said, "The 7th article is enforceable. The Memphis Cotton and Mercantile Company's offer is invalid. Mrs. Honeycutt's cotton allotment remains with the family farm." The silence in the room was broken by Wallace Drummond's deep breath. Charles Brycerson closed the papers in his hand, one after the other. The committee chair added a final note. "We have determined that all cotton allotment agreements containing a pre-1938 farm of origin clause must be protected. This ruling will apply across the state of Tennessee." Within the next 20 days, 27 other families across Tennessee learned that the Memphis Cotton and Mercantile Company, along with 3 other companies, had withdrawn their contract offers. 2 months later, Earl Tyndall took early retirement from his office in Halls. The entire file room was transferred to Mary Lou Hageman's management. In March of 1973, Wallace Drummond was transferred by the Memphis Cotton and Mercantile Company to its Atlanta office. He resigned from the company in 1976 and moved into the insurance industry. In the spring of 1973, when cotton prices jumped to 71 cents a pound, Verlie Mae's 22 acres brought in $7,400 gross in that single year, close to Drummond's entire offer in a single season. From 1973 to 1985, Verlie Mae added another 112 acres to the Honeycutt farm, all in cash, all purchased from neighboring families. By 1980, she was 64 years old and one of the largest independent cotton producers in Lauderdale County. The check Verlie Mae had refused in November of 1972 protected the allotments of 27 Tennessee families, and in the years that followed, set a precedent for similar pre-1938 agreements in Mississippi, Arkansas, and Alabama. Theodore Wickham died in 1979, but before his retirement he took 14 similar cases, and he never lost one. Mary Lou Hageman became the manager of the ASCS office in 1981, and when she retired 12 years later, she had made sure the file room never sent anyone home empty-handed. One evening in 1985, Verlie Mae sat at the kitchen table. The same chair, the same cedar cabinet in the corner. Wendell's paper was now kept in a steel deposit box at the bank, but the first copy was in the top drawer of her own desk. Verlie Mae took it out and read the 7th article one more time. Then she went to the town cemetery, stood in front of Wendell's grave, and her hand stayed on the paper for a while. She did not say anything out loud, but she knew what she needed to know. Some men write sentences for days they will never see. Wendell wrote that sentence in 1938, and he never lived to see it save a farm 34 years later. 22 acres of cotton, a yellowed 1938 agreement, a sentence left behind by a father-in-law. You can leave a comment below. Has a generation before you quietly saved something that would one day protect you? If stories like this one interest you, there are many more on the channel. You can subscribe so you don't miss the new ones.